The clock struck 11:15 p.m. on a cold October night in Chicago. Marcus Johnson sat behind the wheel of his city bus, his large hands gripping the steering wheel with the familiarity that came from 15 years on the job. The night was unusually dark, with heavy rain clouds blocking out even the faintest starlight. Streetlights cast long, wet shadows across the empty roads, creating an eerie atmosphere that made even a veteran driver like Marcus feel uneasy. At 52 years old, Marcus had seen almost everything there was to see on Chicago's South Side routes. His salt and pepper hair and the slight wrinkles around his eyes told stories of thousands of nights just like this one. He wore his dark blue uniform with pride, always keeping it neat and pressed, even during these late-night shifts when hardly anyone would notice. The bus was almost empty now, carrying just 3 passengers. An elderly woman dozing in the middle section, clutching her worn shopping bag, a young man with headphones, bobbing his head to music only he could hear, and a tired-looking nurse still in her scrubs, probably heading home after a long shift at the nearby hospital. Marcus checked his side mirrors out of habit, something he did every few minutes. The streets were getting quieter as the night grew deeper. The rain, which had started as a light drizzle earlier in the evening, was now falling steadily, drumming a constant rhythm on the bus's metal roof. The windshield wipers moved back and forth in a hypnotic pattern, clearing sheets of water only to have them replaced seconds later. As he approached the next stop on South Martin Luther King Drive, Marcus thought about his family. His wife, Teresa, would be asleep by now, but she always left the porch light on for him. Their youngest daughter, Maya, had just started college last month, the first in their family to do so. The thought brought a small smile to his weathered face. All these late nights and extra shifts were worth it just for that. The bus's heating system hummed softly, fighting against the autumn chill that crept in every time the doors opened. Marcus had learned long ago to keep a thermos of hot coffee with him on these night shifts. It sat in its special holder, half empty now, but still warming his hands whenever he needed it. Tonight's route was Route 67, one he knew like the back of his hand. Every pothole, every tricky turn, every timing of the traffic lights, they were all stored in his memory after countless trips up and down these streets. The digital display above his head showed 11:23 p.m. He was right on schedule as usual. Marcus took pride in his punctuality, considering it a matter of personal honor to keep his bus running on time. The radio occasionally crackled with dispatcher messages to other drivers, but his route had been quiet so far. Through his large windshield, Marcus watched the city life wind down. The last few shops were closing their gates, and the usual night crowd was thinning out. Even the regular late-night food spots were starting to clean up for the night. At the next stop, the nurse got off, giving Marcus a tired smile and a quiet thank you. He nodded warmly in return, watching through his mirror to make sure she made it safely to the well-lit entrance of her apartment building. It was an unwritten part of his job, making sure his passengers were safe, especially during these late hours. Marcus didn't know it yet, but in just a few minutes, his regular route would become anything but ordinary. For now, though, he was simply doing what he had done for the past 15 years. Being a guardian of the night roads, watching over his city and its people from behind the wheel of his bus. The elderly woman shifted in her sleep, and the young man with headphones stared out at the rain-soaked streets. Marcus checked his mirrors again, a habit that would soon prove to be more important than he could have imagined. The night was about to take an unexpected turn, and Marcus Johnson's life would never be quite the same again. The digital clock on Marcus's dashboard changed to 11:30 p.m. The rain was falling harder now, creating sheets of water that ran down the bus windows. Marcus squinted through his side mirror, a habit that had become second nature over his years of driving. But this time, something caught his eye that made him sit up straighter in his seat. Through the blur of rain and darkness, he saw a young woman running desperately down the sidewalk. She wore a dark blue coat, now soaked through from the rain, and carried a backpack that bounced wildly against her back as she ran. Even from a distance, Marcus could see the pure fear on her face. Her long brown hair was plastered to her face, and she kept looking back over her shoulder as she ran. The reason for her fear became clear moments later. 2 men were chasing her, their heavy boots splashing through puddles as they gained ground. They wore dark hoodies pulled low over their faces, and their intentions were clearly not good. The young woman stumbled once, catching herself against a lamppost, but the brief delay allowed her pursuers to get even closer. Marcus's heart began to race. In 15 years of driving, He had seen his share of trouble, but something about this situation felt different. The elderly woman who had been sleeping earlier was now awake, her eyes wide with concern as she too noticed what was happening outside. The young man with headphones remained oblivious, still lost in his music. Without hesitation, Marcus checked his mirrors and carefully pulled the bus over to the curb about 50 feet ahead of where the woman was running. His hands moved automatically, muscle memory taking over as he positioned the large vehicle perfectly parallel to the sidewalk. He reached for the door control, his finger hovering over the button, ready to act. The woman saw the bus and changed direction slightly, running straight for it. Marcus could see her face more clearly now. She couldn't have been more than 25 years old. Her mascara had run from the rain or tears or both, leaving dark streaks down her cheeks. She was gasping for breath, each exhale creating small clouds in the cold night air. The two men were closing in, not just 20 feet behind her. One of them shouted something that was lost in the sound of the rain and traffic. Marcus hit the door control button just as the woman reached the bus, the pneumatic doors swishing open with what seemed like agonizing slowness. She practically threw herself up the steps, stumbling into the bus. Her wet shoes squeaked against the floor as she grabbed onto a handrail to steady herself. She was shaking, whether from fear or cold or both, Marcus couldn't tell. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she tried to speak. "Please, please help," she managed to say between breaths. "They've been following me since the shelter." The two men reached the bus just seconds later, and Marcus could see them clearly now. They were younger than he at first thought, probably in their early 30s. One had a small scar above his right eyebrow, visible even under his hood. The other was taller, with a muscular build that made him look even more threatening. The elderly passenger had moved to the middle of the bus, placing herself protectively near the young woman. Even the young man had finally noticed what was happening, pulling his headphones off and watching the scene unfold with a mixture of confusion and concern. Marcus stood up from his seat, drawing himself up to his full height of 6 feet 2 inches. His years in the military before becoming a bus driver had taught him how to project authority, and he put every ounce of that training into his stance now. He positioned himself between the doors, effectively blocking the entrance with his broad shoulders. "This bus is equipped with 8 security cameras," Marcus announced in a clear, firm voice that carried over the sound of the rain. "Every move you make is being recorded and streamed directly to the transit authority." This wasn't entirely true. The cameras recorded but didn't stream live, but Marcus doubted these men knew that detail. The two pursuers hesitated at the bottom of the steps, rainwater dripping from their hoodies. Marcus could see them weighing their options, looking from the trembling woman to the security cameras mounted in the bus's ceiling. The next few seconds would determine how the situation would unfold, and Marcus prepared himself for whatever might come next. The taller man took a step onto the first bus step, his wet boot making a squeaking sound against the metal. Marcus didn't move an inch, keeping his stance firm and protective. Behind him, he could hear the young woman's frightened breathing, mixed with the soft whispers of the elderly passenger who was trying to comfort her. "This girl needs to come with us," the man with the scar said, his voice trying to sound casual but carrying an edge of threat. "It's a family matter." He smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes, which remained cold and calculating. Marcus had been in enough difficult situations to know when someone was lying. His years in the military had taught him to read people, and everything about these men screamed danger. His right hand slowly moved to the emergency button under his driver's panel, pressing it without looking down. He knew that silent alarm would bring police to their location within minutes. "I don't think so," Marcus replied calmly, his deep voice steady and authoritative. "This young lady clearly doesn't want to go anywhere with you, and as long as she's on my bus, she's under my protection." He kept his eyes fixed on both men, watching for any sudden movements. The young man with the headphones had moved closer to the front of the bus, his phone held up discreetly. Marcus caught a glimpse of the red recording light on the phone's screen. Smart kid, Marcus thought. More evidence was always better. The taller man's face darkened with anger. "Listen, old man," he growled, taking another step up. "You don't want to get involved in this. Just let us take her, and everyone goes home happy." His hand moved slightly, and Marcus caught the glint of something metal partially hidden in his pocket. But Marcus stood his ground. "I've already called the police," he announced loudly, making sure his voice carried to anyone who might be passing by outside. "They'll be here any minute." Those cameras are recording everything, and now you're threatening a city employee. That's a federal offense." The mention of police made both men hesitate. The one with the scar grabbed his friend's arm, whispering something urgently. They looked around nervously, suddenly aware of their exposed position. Through the bus windows, Marcus could see a few people on the street had stopped to watch the scene, some with their phones out. In the distance, the distinct sound of police sirens could be heard getting closer. The young woman behind Marcus let out a small sob of relief. The elderly passenger had her arm around the girl's shoulders, her other hand gripping her umbrella like a weapon, ready to help if needed. "This isn't over," the taller man spat out, but Marcus could see the fear creeping into his eyes. The mention of police and the growing crowd of witnesses had changed the situation dramatically. Both men backed down the steps quickly, almost slipping on the wet metal. They turned and ran into the rainy night, disappearing down a dark side street. Marcus watched them go, making sure they were really leaving before he finally relaxed his stance. He quickly shut the bus doors and turned to the young woman, who was still shaking but looking slightly less terrified. "You're safe now," he said gently. "The police are on their way. We'll wait right here for them." The elderly passenger guided the young woman to a seat, pulling some tissues from her bag to help dry her face. The young man with the headphones approached Marcus, showing him the video he recorded on his phone. "I got everything, sir," he said proudly. "Their faces, the threats, all of it." Marcus nodded appreciatively, then got on his radio to inform the dispatch about the situation. He could see 2 police cars approaching with their lights flashing, reflecting off the wet streets. As he waited for them to arrive, Marcus kept checking his mirrors, making sure the men hadn't come back. The young woman was starting to catch her breath, her hands still trembling as she accepted a bottle of water from the elderly passenger. None of them knew it yet, but this rainy night encounter would soon become much more than just another crime story in the local news. The identity of the young woman and the consequences of Marcus's brave actions would send ripples through the entire city. 2 police cars pulled up alongside the bus, their red and blue lights flashing through the rain streaked windows. Marcus watched as 4 officers stepped out, their uniforms already getting wet in the continuing downpour. The young woman sat quietly, still wrapped in the elderly passenger's coat, looking both relieved and nervous at the same time. Officer Rodriguez was the first to board the bus. She had worked this beat for years and knew Marcus from previous incidents. "Everyone okay here?" she asked, scanning the scene professionally. Behind her, another officer was already taking notes. "I'm fine now," the young woman said softly. She reached into her wet backpack with shaking hands and pulled out a wallet. "My name is Sarah Mitchell. I should probably show you my ID." The moment Sarah said her name, Officer Rodriguez's eyes widened in recognition. She immediately reached for her radio. "Dispatch, be advised, we have located Sarah Mitchell. She's safe. Please inform the commissioner immediately." Marcus looked confused. He watched as the officer's entire demeanor changed, becoming more alert and formal. The young man who had recorded the incident on his phone whispered to Marcus, "Mitchell, isn't that the police commissioner's last name?" Before Marcus could respond, more police cars arrived, their sirens cutting through the night. Within minutes, a large black SUV pulled up, and a tall man in a suit stepped out, barely noticing the rain as he rushed toward the bus. His face was tight with worry. "Daddy," Sarah called out as Commissioner James Mitchell boarded the bus. The tough-looking police commissioner's face softened immediately as he hugged his daughter. "I'm okay," she assured him, though her voice still trembled slightly. "This bus driver, he saved me." Commissioner Mitchell turned to Marcus, who was still standing by his driver's seat. "You protected my daughter," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The commissioner looked tired, with dark circles under his eyes suggesting he had been up all night, probably coordinating the search for his daughter. Sarah began explaining what had happened. "I was leaving the homeless shelter where I volunteer," she said, wiping her eyes. "I usually take the bus home because I want to be treated like everyone else. Those men had been watching the shelter. They must have recognized me." The elderly passenger spoke up, her voice firm despite her age. "Your daughter was very brave, Commissioner. And this driver," she gestured to Marcus, "he stood up to those thugs like a true hero." Marcus listened as Sarah continued her story, learning that she had been secretly volunteering at the shelter for months, not wanting special treatment because of her father's position. The commissioner had been pushing for better safety measures on public transport, including more security cameras and emergency response systems. Now, ironically, those very systems had helped save his own daughter. The young man stepped forward, still holding his phone. "Sir, I recorded everything," he told the commissioner, who immediately called over a detective to secure the evidence. The footage would prove invaluable in identifying the attackers. As the officers took statements from everyone on the bus, Marcus learned more about Sarah. She was 23, a recent college graduate who had chosen to work with the homeless despite her privileged background. She had kept her volunteer work quiet, taking the bus like any ordinary citizen, believing that everyone deserved to be treated the same regardless of their status. "I didn't want to be known as the commissioner's daughter," Sarah explained to Marcus, now wrapped in a dry blanket provided by the paramedics who had arrived to check on her. "I just wanted to help people." Commissioner Mitchell stood nearby, talking quietly but intensely into his phone, likely updating other officials about the situation. He kept glancing at his daughter, as if making sure she was still there and safe. Marcus sat in his driver's seat, watching as the scene unfolded around him. He had simply done what he thought was right, what any decent person would do. He had no idea that his actions would not only save the police commissioner's daughter, but would soon lead to changes that would affect the entire city's transportation system. The rain continued to fall outside, but inside the bus, under the bright interior lights, a father held his daughter close, a group of officers gathered evidence, and a humble bus driver was about to become much more than just another face in the city's vast transportation network. The next morning, Marcus Johnson's phone wouldn't stop ringing. He sat at his kitchen table, still tired from last night's events, while his wife Teresa watched the morning news with wide eyes. Their small living room was filled with the sound of news reporters talking about the heroic bus driver who saved the commissioner's daughter. Marcus Johnson, a 15-year veteran of the Chicago Transit Authority, confronted two attackers who were pursuing Sarah Mitchell, daughter of Police Commissioner James Mitchell, the TV reporter announced, standing in front of the bus stop where everything had happened. Behind her, people were laying flowers at the spot. Teresa poured her husband another cup of coffee. "You never told me it was the commissioner's daughter," she said, shaking her head in amazement. Their daughter Maya had already called 3 times from college, excited that her dad was being called a hero on the news. Marcus's supervisor had given him the day off, but the media wouldn't leave him alone. Reporters kept calling, wanting to hear his story. Even the mayor's office had called, asking him to attend a special ceremony later that week. Around noon, there was a knock at their door. When Teresa opened it, she found Sarah Mitchell standing there with a small gift basket. She looked different from last night, composed and professional, though her eyes still showed signs of the fear she had experienced. "I hope it's okay that I came," Sarah said as she sat in their living room. "Dad's officers found those men this morning. They were part of a gang that had been targeting people around the shelter." She paused, twisting a tissue in her hands. "They knew who I was and were planning to kidnap me for ransom." Marcus listened as Sarah explained how the police had raided several locations after identifying the men from the young passenger's video recording. They had found evidence that the gang had been watching her for weeks, learning her volunteer schedule at the homeless shelter. "Your actions didn't just save me," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. "The police found plans to target other volunteers too. You helped break up an entire criminal operation." The afternoon newspapers carried the story on their front pages. Pictures showed the police raid, the arrested gang members, and a large photo of Marcus standing next to his bus. The headlines read, "Bus driver's bravery leads to major crime ring bust." Commissioner Mitchell had called a press conference where he spoke about public transportation safety. "Last night proved why our transit workers are essential frontline workers," he said, standing at a podium covered in microphones. "They're not just driving vehicles, they're protecting our community." The story grew bigger as more details emerged. The gang had been responsible for several other crimes in the area. Social media was filled with clips from the security cameras and the passenger's phone video, showing how Marcus had stood his ground against the attackers. By evening, Marcus's small house was crowded with family members who had come to congratulate him. His brother brought pizza, and his sister-in-law made his favorite apple pie. They all gathered around the TV, watching as different news channels told the story. "Dad, you're trending on Twitter," Maya exclaimed during their video call. She sent screenshots of thousands of people sharing the story, calling him a hero and thanking him for his service to the city. But what touched Marcus most was a letter that arrived from a group of shelter volunteers. They wrote about how Sarah had worked alongside them for months, never mentioning her father's position, always staying late to help serve meals and organize donations. They thanked Marcus for protecting one of their own. Teresa found her husband sitting quietly in their backyard later that night, looking at the stars that were finally visible after the rain had cleared. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, sitting beside him. "I keep thinking about how many other people ride my bus every night," he said softly. "How many of them might need help but are afraid to ask? How many other drivers face situations like this?" The events of that rainy night were about to change more than just Marcus's life. They would lead to new safety measures, better protection for transit workers, and a closer look at how the city protected its most vulnerable citizens. But for now, Marcus just sat with his wife, grateful that he had been there when someone needed help. 1 week after the incident, Marcus stood in front of a large mirror in his bedroom, adjusting his tie. He wasn't used to wearing formal clothes, preferring his comfortable bus driver's uniform. But today was different. The mayor was holding a special ceremony at City Hall to honor his actions, and everyone would be there. "You look handsome," Teresa said, helping him straighten his jacket. She had taken the day off from her teaching job to be with him. Their daughter Maya had even gotten permission to miss classes and drive home from college for the event. When they arrived at City Hall, Marcus was surprised to see dozens of his fellow bus drivers standing on the steps, all in their uniforms. They clapped as he walked up, many of them holding signs that read "Our Hero" and "Best Driver in Chicago." Inside the Grand Hall, camera flashes went off as Marcus walked to his seat in the front row. Sarah Mitchell sat nearby with her father, wearing a beautiful blue dress. She smiled and waved at Marcus's family. The elderly passenger from that night was there too, sitting proudly with her family, and even the young man who had recorded the video had been invited. Mayor Thompson stepped up to the podium, her voice echoing through the packed room. "Today, we honor not just one heroic act, but a lifetime of service," she began. "What many of you don't know is that this wasn't the first time Marcus Johnson has helped someone in need." The large screen behind her lit up with pictures and newspaper clippings. There was Marcus helping an elderly man with a walker during a snowstorm. Another showed him waiting with a lost child until the police arrived. Each image told a story of small acts of kindness that had gone unnoticed over the years. Last month, he stayed 2 hours after his shift to drive a woman to the hospital when her car broke down. The mayor continued. 3 years ago, he saved a teenager from gang recruitment by helping him get a job. Marcus never sought recognition for these acts. He simply saw people in need and helped them. Sarah Mitchell stood up next to speak. She had recovered from her ordeal and looked confident as she addressed the crowd. "Mr. Johnson didn't just save me from those attackers," she said. "He showed me that one person's courage can inspire an entire city." Then came the biggest surprise. Commissioner Mitchell announced that the police department was starting a new program called Guardian Drivers, inspired by Marcus's actions. Bus drivers would receive special training to help them recognize and respond to dangerous situations. The first training center would be named after Marcus. Marcus's old Army sergeant, now retired, had traveled from Florida to attend. He stood up and shared stories about Marcus's bravery during his military service. "He was always the one looking out for others," the sergeant said, his voice rough with emotion. "Some people are just born to be protectors." The young man who had recorded the video that night revealed that he had started a social media campaign. Thousands of people had shared their own stories about kind bus drivers who had helped them over the years. The hashtag #BeLikeMarcus was trending nationwide. Maya stood up next, making her father tear up as she spoke about growing up watching him help others. "My dad taught me that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared," she said. "It means you do what's right even when you are scared." At the end of the ceremony, Mayor Thompson presented Marcus with the city's highest civilian honor, a golden medal that shone under the bright lights. But what touched Marcus most was the gift from his fellow drivers, a handmade book filled with letters from passengers whose lives he had touched over the years. As photographers took pictures and reporters called out questions, Marcus stood quietly, the medal heavy around his neck. He thought about his next shift, about the regular people who would get on his bus, each with their own stories and struggles. Teresa squeezed his hand, knowing what he was thinking. "You're still going to drive that same route, aren't you?" she asked with a smile. Marcus nodded. Someone needs to look out for them, he said simply. That's what we do. That's what all of us drivers do. The ceremony ended with a standing ovation, but Marcus knew that tomorrow he would be back behind the wheel, doing what he had always done, being a guardian of the night roads, watching over his city and its people, one bus ride at a time. 3 months after the incident that changed everything, Marcus sat in a large classroom at the new Guardian Drivers Training Center. Around him, 30 bus drivers listened carefully as Sarah Mitchell spoke about safety and awareness. The walls were decorated with posters showing emergency procedures and community resources. You might think you're just driving a bus, Sarah said, standing confidently at the front of the room, but you're really connecting communities and protecting people. She had become the lead instructor for the new program, leaving her office job to work full-time on public transportation safety. The changes across the city were remarkable. Every bus now had improved security cameras with direct links to police dispatch. Special emergency buttons were installed not just for drivers, but also for passengers. Blue emergency lights have been added to the outside of buses, making them easy to spot from a distance. Commissioner Mitchell had kept his promise. The city had invested millions in making public transportation safer. But the biggest change wasn't in the equipment, it was in how people viewed bus drivers. Yesterday, a woman came up to me at the shelter. Sarah told the class, sharing a recent story. She said she feels safe taking the late bus home now because she knows the drivers are trained to help. That's what this program is about. Marcus watched as his fellow drivers took notes and asked questions. Some were young, just starting their careers, while others had been driving for decades. They'd all wore new badges that identified them as Guardian Drivers, a title that carried respect throughout the city. During the lunch break, Marcus walked to his old bus stop where everything had happened. The spot had become something of a landmark. A small plaque had been installed, reading "Kindness stops here," a reminder of that rainy night. People often left flowers or thank you notes. Back at the training center, the afternoon session focused on practical skills. Marcus demonstrated how to handle different emergency situations. His military background and years of driving experience made him a natural teacher. The other drivers called him Chief, a nickname that had stuck since the ceremony. Remember, Marcus told them, sometimes just being alert and showing you care can prevent problems before they start. He shared stories from his route, like how checking mirrors regularly had helped him spot trouble, or how greeting regular passengers helped build trust. The local news had picked up on the program's success. Crime rates around bus stops had dropped significantly. More people were using public transportation, especially at night, knowing they had trained professionals looking out for them. Sarah's shelter work had expanded too. She had started a program helping homeless people get bus passes and connecting them with drivers who could guide them to safe shelters and resources. The same gang that had tried to kidnap her was now in prison, their network completely broken. Later that evening, Marcus drove his regular route. His bus looked different now, newer equipment, better lights, and a special console for emergencies. But he still treated it the same way, keeping it clean and welcoming for everyone who stepped aboard. The elderly passenger who had helped comfort Sarah that night had become a regular on his route. She now volunteered with Sarah at the shelter, inspired by what she had witnessed. "You started something good," she told Marcus as she boarded the bus. "People are looking out for each other more." At each stop, Marcus noticed how passengers seemed more aware, more connected. They nodded to each other, helped with heavy bags, and kept an eye out for their fellow riders. The city's buses had become more than just transportation. They were moving communities. The young man who had recorded the video that night had graduated from college and now worked for the Transit Authority, managing their social media. He shared stories of Guardian drivers helping people across the city, inspiring other cities to start similar programs. As Marcus finished his shift that night, he thought about how one moment of courage had created waves of change. His daughter Maya had written a college paper about it, titled "How One Bus Route Changed a City." She got an A+, and her professor had shared it with the mayor. The last passenger of the night, a nurse heading home from her late shift, smiled as she got off the bus. "Thanks for being our guardian," she said, using the phrase that had become common across the city. Marcus smiled back, knowing that tomorrow he would do it all again, protecting his passengers one bus stop at a time. 1 year had passed since that rainy night when Marcus Johnson had stood up to protect a stranger on his bus. On a bright Sunday morning, he stood with his family at the grand opening of the city's newest building, the Johnson Public Transportation Safety Center. The five-story building gleamed in the morning sun. Its modern design included a training facility, a community center, and a museum dedicated to public transportation workers who had made a difference in people's lives. Marcus's story was featured prominently, but he wasn't the only hero whose tale was told there. "Dad, look," Maya called out, pointing to a wall of photographs. There were pictures from that famous night, but also dozens of other images showing bus drivers helping people across the city. Each photo told a different story of courage and kindness. Sarah Mitchell, now the Director of Public Transportation Safety, stood at the podium to address the crowd. She looked confident and strong, very different from the frightened young woman Marcus had helped that night. "1 year ago, a bus driver showed us that heroes don't always wear capes," she began. "Sometimes they wear bus driver uniforms." The audience included hundreds of Guardian drivers, all wearing their special badges. The program had grown beyond anyone's expectations. 20 other cities had copied Chicago's model, creating their own Guardian drivers programs. Marcus's training methods were being taught across the country. Teresa squeezed her husband's hand as they listened to the speeches. She remembered how nervous Marcus had been about all the attention at first. Now he had helped train over 1,000 drivers, sharing his experience and wisdom with each one. Commissioner Mitchell, who had recently been elected mayor, spoke next. "When my daughter was in danger that night, Marcus Johnson didn't see the police commissioner's daughter. He saw someone who needed help. That's the spirit that has transformed our city." The statistics told an impressive story. Crime around public transportation had dropped by 60%. More people were using buses and trains than ever before. The shelters where Sarah volunteered reported that more homeless people were getting help because they felt safe taking buses to reach services. The young man who had recorded the video was now running the center's social media department. He had created an app that connected passengers with Guardian drivers, making public transportation even safer. "It all started with one video," he told the crowd. "Now we have millions of people watching out for each other." Marcus's old bus had been retired and placed in the center's museum. It stood as a reminder of that important night, but also of the thousands of quiet acts of kindness that happened on buses every day. Visitors could sit in the driver's seat and listen to recordings of real stories from Guardian drivers. Maya had graduated college and chosen to work at the center, coordinating with schools to teach young people about community safety. "My father taught me that everyone can make a difference," she told a group of students. "You just have to be brave enough to care." The elderly passenger who had comforted Sarah that night had become a regular speaker at driver training sessions. She shared her perspective on how small acts of kindness could change lives. "We're not just passengers anymore," she said. "We're a family looking out for each other." At the end of the ceremony, Marcus was asked to cut the ribbon to officially open the center. As he held the large scissors, he thought about all the changes that had come from that one rainy night. But what made him most proud wasn't the building or the recognition. It was knowing that people felt safer in his city. "What are you thinking about?" Teresa asked, seeing the thoughtful look on his face. Marcus smiled, watching as people entered the new building. "I'm thinking about all the lives that will be saved here," he said. "All the people who will learn to help others, all the communities that will grow stronger." As the crowd moved inside to tour the building, a young bus driver approached Marcus. "Chief," she said, using his nickname, "I start my first night shift tomorrow. Any advice?" Marcus put a hand on her shoulder, remembering his own first night shift many years ago. "Just remember," he said warmly, "you're not just driving a bus. You're guarding dreams, protecting hopes, and connecting lives. Every person who steps on your bus is part of our community's story." The legacy of that rainy night would continue to grow, touching more lives and inspiring more heroes. But for Marcus Johnson, it would always come back to one simple truth: sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of courage.